The moment Eleanor Morgan saw the dark wall of clouds racing across the Montana sky in September of 1884, she knew her father had been right to worry about her riding out alone to check the northern fence line. She dug her heels into her mare's sides, urging the horse toward the nearest shelter she could remember, a line shack about 2 miles west. The wind picked up with terrifying speed, whipping her long brown hair from its pins and sending it flying around her face. Cold droplets began to pelt her skin, and within moments the sky opened up entirely. Rain came down in sheets so thick she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Eleanor was 22 years old and had lived on her father's ranch her entire life, but she had never seen a storm move in this fast. Her hands were numb on the reins by the time she spotted the small wooden structure through the downpour. She guided her horse to the lean-to attached to the side of the shack and practically fell from the saddle, her legs shaking from cold and adrenaline. She was reaching for the door when it swung open from the inside. A man stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the dim interior. He was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a worn brown coat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. For a moment neither of them moved, and Eleanor felt her heart hammer against her ribs. "Get inside before you freeze to death," the man said, his voice rough but not unkind. He stepped back to let her pass. Eleanor hesitated only a second before the wind gusted so hard it nearly knocked her sideways. She stumbled through the door, water streaming from her clothes and forming puddles on the wooden floor. The man closed the door behind her, shutting out the howling wind. The shack was small, maybe 15 feet square, with a pot-bellied stove in one corner that radiated blessed warmth. There was a narrow cot against one wall, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and shelves holding supplies. A single window showed nothing but gray rain. "Thank you," Eleanor managed through chattering teeth. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly aware of how her wet dress clung to her body. The man moved to the stove without looking at her directly. "There is a blanket on the cot. You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." Eleanor felt heat rise to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the stove. "I cannot just undress with you here." "Then wrap yourself in the blanket first," he said, still not turning around. "I will face the wall." "But you need to get dry." There was something in his tone that brooked no argument. Eleanor realized he was right. Her teeth were chattering so hard she could barely speak, and her fingers were turning blue. She grabbed the rough wool blanket from the cot and turned her back to him. "Tell me when you are not looking," she said. "I am looking at the wall," he confirmed. Eleanor's fingers fumbled with the buttons of her dress, clumsy with cold. It took her several minutes to peel the wet fabric away from her skin. She removed everything down to her chemise and drawers, which were damp but not soaked through, then wrapped the blanket around herself tightly. Her wet clothes she draped over one of the chairs, positioning it near the stove. "All right," she said quietly. The man turned around then, and for the first time she got a good look at him. He was perhaps 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes the color of storm clouds. His face was weathered from years in the sun, with strong features and a jaw darkened by stubble. There was something guarded in his expression, a wariness that made Eleanor think he was not used to company. "I am Eleanor Morgan," she said. "My father owns the Double M Ranch about 5 miles south of here." "I know who you are," the man said. He moved to the table and poured something from a tin cup into another cup, then handed it to her. "Drink this. It is just water, but it will help." Eleanor took the cup with trembling hands and sipped. The man was watching her with an unreadable expression. "You have me at a disadvantage," she said. "You know my name, but I do not know yours." He hesitated, then said, "James Hartley. I work for the Miller outfit running their North Range." Eleanor knew the Miller Ranch. It bordered her father's property to the west. "I have not seen you in town." "I do not go to town much," James said simply. He moved back to the stove, putting more distance between them. An awkward silence fell. Outside, the storm raged with increasing fury. Thunder rolled across the sky and lightning flashed through the window. Eleanor pulled the blanket tighter around herself and perched on the edge of the cot. "How long do you think the storm will last?" she asked. James glanced at the window. "Could be hours, could be all night, hard to say." The reality of the situation settled over Eleanor like a weight. She was trapped in a tiny shack with a man she did not know, possibly until morning. Her father would be sick with worry, and her reputation would be in tatters if anyone found out she had spent the night alone with a cowboy. As if reading her thoughts, James said, "I will sleep on the floor, you can have the cot." "That is not necessary," Eleanor protested, though relief flooded through her. "It is," James said firmly. He pulled one of the chairs closer to the stove and sat down, angling his body away from her. "You should try to rest. It has been a hard ride in the cold." Eleanor wanted to argue, but exhaustion was seeping into her bones. The warmth from the stove and the rough comfort of the blanket were making her eyelids heavy. She lay down on the cot, tucking the blanket around herself, and watched James's silhouette against the stove light. He sat perfectly still, his shoulders rigid, staring at the wall. There was something almost painful in his deliberate distance, as if he were afraid to even look in her direction. Eleanor wondered what had happened to make him so careful, so guarded. "Thank you for taking me in," she said softly. Not every man would be so decent. James's shoulders tensed even more. Any man who would not help a woman in a storm like this is no man at all. Something in his voice made Eleanor's chest tighten. She wanted to ask him more, to understand the shadows she saw in his eyes, but her exhaustion won out. Within minutes, lulled by the warmth and the drumming of rain on the roof, she fell into a deep sleep. She woke sometime later to darkness broken only by the faint glow of the stove. The storm was still raging outside, perhaps even stronger than before. Eleanor sat up, disoriented, and saw James still sitting in the chair by the stove. He had not moved. "You should sleep," she said, her voice rough with sleep. "I am fine," James said without turning. "You cannot sit in that chair all night, you will be miserable. I have spent worse nights in worse places." Eleanor felt a surge of frustration at his stubborn nobility. "At least lie down on the floor with a blanket. There is no sense in both of us being uncomfortable." "I only have the one blanket," James said. "Then we will share it," Eleanor said before she could think better of it. James finally turned to look at her, his eyes wide with shock. "Miss Morgan, that would not be proper." "Nothing about this situation is proper," Eleanor pointed out. "But we are both adults and we are both cold, and there is no sense in freezing to death for the sake of propriety that is already compromised simply by us being here together." James stared at her for a long moment. In the dim light from the stove, his face was all angles and shadows. "I do not think that is a good idea." "Why not?" Eleanor challenged. "Do you not trust yourself?" "I do not trust myself," James said quietly, and there was such raw honesty in his voice that Eleanor felt her breath catch. The air between them seemed to thicken. Eleanor's heart was pounding, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I trust you. You have been nothing but respectful since I arrived, and I am freezing and you must be too. Please just come lie down, we can keep the blanket between us." James looked torn, his jaw working as he fought some internal battle. Finally, he stood up slowly. "All right. But I will stay on top of the blanket and you will stay under it." "Agreed," Eleanor said, moving to make room on the narrow cot. James approached cautiously, as if she were a wild animal that might spook. He lay down on the very edge of the cot, as far from Eleanor as the small space would allow, positioning himself on top of the blanket as promised. His body was rigid, every muscle tense. Eleanor pulled the blanket up to her chin and turned on her side to face away from him. Even with the blanket between them, she could feel the warmth of his body, could hear his carefully controlled breathing. The cot was so narrow that his shoulder nearly touched hers. "Thank you," she whispered. James did not respond, but she felt him relax slightly, some of the tension leaving his frame. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but she was acutely aware of every breath James took, every tiny movement he made. She had never been this close to a man before, had never felt this strange mix of nervousness and comfort. There was something about James that drew her, something in his quiet strength and his careful honor that made her want to know more about him. The storm continued to rage outside, and gradually Eleanor felt sleep pulling at her again. Just before she drifted off, she thought she felt James shift slightly closer, as if drawn by the same inexplicable pull she felt toward him. When Eleanor woke again, pale gray light was filtering through the window. The storm had passed, leaving behind only the steady drip of water from the eaves. She was warm and comfortable, and it took her a moment to realize why. Sometime during the night, she and James had moved together. Her back was pressed against his chest, his arm draped over her waist, their legs tangled together. The blanket had shifted so that it covered them both. She could feel his breath stirring her hair, could feel the solid warmth of him all along her body. Eleanor's first instinct was to pull away, but something made her stay still. In sleep, James had let down his guard, had allowed himself this closeness that he would never permit while awake. She could feel his heartbeat against her back, steady and strong. She knew she should move, should wake him before this became even more awkward, but she found herself reluctant to break this unexpected intimacy. For just a moment, she let herself enjoy the feeling of being held, of being warm and safe in a man's arms. Then James stirred, and Eleanor felt his body go rigid as he realized their position. He pulled away so fast he nearly fell off the cot, stumbling to his feet and putting half the room between them before Eleanor could even turn over. "I am sorry," he said, his voice rough. His face was flushed and he would not meet her eyes. "I did not mean to. I must have moved in my sleep. I apologize." "It is all right," Eleanor said, sitting up and clutching the blanket around herself. "I do not think either of us moved deliberately. It was just the cold." James nodded jerkily, still not looking at her. He moved to the stove and began stoking the fire, his movements almost violent in their intensity. "The storm has passed. You should be able to ride home safely now. I will step outside while you dress." Before Eleanor could respond, he grabbed his hat and coat and stepped out into the gray morning, closing the door firmly behind him. Eleanor sat on the cot for a moment, her heart racing. Something had shifted between them in the night, some barrier had been crossed even if only in sleep. She could still feel the imprint of his body against hers, could still feel the strange ache in her chest at his swift retreat. She dressed quickly in her clothes, which had dried by the stove overnight. They were wrinkled and stiff, but at least they were warm. She folded the blanket neatly and set it back on the cot, then opened the door. James was standing by the lean to where her horse waited. He had already saddled the mare, and he was checking the cinch with his back to the shack. When he heard the door open, his shoulders tensed, but he did not turn around. "Your horse is ready," he said. Eleanor walked over to him slowly. The morning air was crisp and clean after the storm, and the world looked washed new. She could see for miles across the rolling grassland, all the way to the distant mountains. "James," she said softly. He finally turned to face her, but his eyes were shuttered, guarded again. All the warmth she had felt from him during the night was gone, replaced by careful distance. "Thank you for your hospitality," Eleanor said. "You saved my life last night. If I had tried to ride through that storm, I do not know what would have happened." "Any man would have done the same," James said, echoing his words from the night before. "But you are not any man," Eleanor said. She was not sure why she said it, but it was true. There was something different about James Hartley, something that called to her in a way she did not fully understand. James's jaw tightened. "You should go home, Miss Morgan. Your father will be worried." He was right, of course. Eleanor had no good reason to linger. But as she looked at James's carefully blank face, she found herself reluctant to leave. The night they had shared, strange and unexpected as it was, had created something between them. She wanted to understand what it was, wanted to see behind the walls he had built so carefully around himself. "Will I see you again?" she asked. "I do not come into town much," James said, not really answering the question. but you work the North Range. I ride this way often to check our fences." "Then perhaps our paths will cross," James said neutrally. Eleanor felt frustration rise in her chest. He was being deliberately evasive, deliberately putting distance between them. She wanted to demand to know why, wanted to break through his careful control, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Thank you again," she said instead. She moved to her horse and put her foot in the stirrup. James moved to help her mount, his hands careful and impersonal as he steadied her. But for just a moment, as Eleanor settled into the saddle, their eyes met. And in that brief instant, Eleanor saw something in his gaze that made her breath catch. Longing, sharp and painful, want carefully suppressed, and beneath it all, fear. Then James stepped back, breaking the connection, and his face was carefully blank again. "Safe travels, Miss Morgan," he said. Eleanor gathered her reins, her mind racing. "Goodbye, Mr. Hartley." She turned her horse south and rode away without looking back, though every instinct screamed at her to turn around. She could feel James's eyes on her until she crested the first rise and dropped out of sight. The ride home took less than an hour in the clear morning air. As Eleanor had expected, her father was frantic with worry. Henry Morgan met her at the barn, his weathered face drawn with anxiety. "Eleanor, thank God," he said, pulling her into a fierce hug as soon as she dismounted. "I have been out of my mind. When you did not come home before the storm hit, I thought—" "I am sorry, Papa," Eleanor said, hugging him back. "I took shelter in the old line shack on the north boundary. I was perfectly safe." Henry pulled back and looked at her closely. "You were alone." Eleanor hesitated just a fraction too long, and her father's eyes narrowed. "Who was with you?" he demanded. There was no point in lying. Someone would see her riding away from the shack, or James would mention it to his foreman and word would get out. It always did in small communities. "A cowboy from the Miller Ranch," Eleanor said carefully. "James Hartley. He was already there when I arrived. Papa, he was a perfect gentleman. He gave me the blanket and slept in a chair all night. Nothing improper happened." That was not quite true, given how they had woken up tangled together, but Eleanor pushed that memory away. Her father did not need to know every detail. Henry's face had gone hard. "A cowboy? You spent the night alone with a cowboy in a line shack. What was I supposed to do?" Eleanor asked, feeling her temper rise. "Ride through the storm and freeze to death. He saved my life, Papa." "That may be," Henry said grimly, "but your reputation is ruined now. If word gets out that you spent the night alone with a man, no decent family will have anything to do with you." "That is ridiculous," Eleanor protested. "Nothing happened, and it was a storm, for heaven's sake. Anyone reasonable would understand. You know as well as I do that people are not always reasonable, especially when it comes to a young woman's virtue," Henry said. He ran a hand through his graying hair, looking suddenly old and tired. "We will have to be very careful about how we handle this." Eleanor felt guilt twist in her stomach. She had not thought about the consequences when she had ridden out yesterday, had not considered what would happen if she were caught in a storm. She had just wanted to help, to check the fences like she always did. "I am sorry," she said quietly. Henry's expression softened. He reached out and cupped her cheek gently. "I know you are, sweetheart, and I am not angry with you. I am just worried. Let me think about this. In the meantime, do not mention to anyone where you spent the night. If we are lucky, no one will ask too many questions." But luck was not on their side. By the next day, word had spread through town like wildfire. Eleanor was not sure how it had gotten out, whether someone had seen her leaving the line shack or whether James had mentioned it to someone who talked. Either way, by the time she rode into town for supplies 2 days after the storm, she could feel the weight of disapproving stares. Women she had known her whole life crossed the street to avoid her. Men looked at her with a new speculation in their eyes that made her skin crawl. Even the shopkeeper, who had always been friendly, was cold and distant when she came to his counter. Eleanor held her head high and completed her errands with as much dignity as she could muster. But by the time she rode home, her eyes were stinging with angry tears. It was so unfair. She had done nothing wrong, had simply sought shelter from a storm, and now she was being treated like a fallen woman. Her father was waiting for her when she got home, his face grave. "I heard about the reception you got in town," he said. "It was horrible," Eleanor admitted, her voice tight. "Papa, what am I going to do?" Henry was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "There might be one solution. If you were to marry the man you spent the night with, it would quiet the gossip. People would assume you were already engaged, that the situation was not as improper as it seemed." Eleanor stared at her father in shock. "Marry James Hartley? Papa, I barely know him." "I know," Henry said, "but I do not see many other options. Your reputation is damaged, Eleanor. No respectable man will court you now, and I will not always be here to protect you. What will you do when I am gone if you have no husband to provide for you?" The thought was chilling, but Eleanor could not bring herself to accept it. "I cannot just marry a stranger because of gossip. That is insane." "Then what do you propose to do?" Henry asked, not unkindly. Eleanor had no answer. She went to bed that night with her mind churning, unable to sleep. She kept thinking about James, about the way he had held himself so carefully apart from her, about the longing she had seen in his eyes for just a moment before he hid it away. What kind of man was he? What had made him so guarded? And why did the thought of seeing him again make her heart beat faster? 3 days later, Eleanor rode north again. She told herself she was just checking the fences, doing her normal work, but she knew the truth. She was hoping to run into James Hartley. She did not see him the first day or the second. But on the third day, as she was riding along the boundary between her father's land and the Miller Ranch, she spotted a figure on horseback in the distance. Her heart leaped, and she urged her horse into a canter. As she got closer, she could see it was indeed James. He was checking a section of fence, his back to her. "Mr. Hartley," Eleanor called out. James turned, and even from a distance she could see the tension that entered his body when he recognized her. He sat frozen on his horse as she rode up to him, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Morgan," he said when she was close enough. "What are you doing out here?" "The same thing you are, I expect," Eleanor said. "Checking fences. This is the boundary between our ranches." James nodded stiffly. "The storm brought down some trees. I have been clearing them." An awkward silence fell. Eleanor searched for something to say, some way to break through the wall James had erected between them. "I wanted to thank you again," she started, but James cut her off. "You already thanked me." "There is no need to do so again." "Actually, there is," Eleanor said, feeling her temper stir. "Because of that night, my reputation in town has been destroyed. Everyone is treating me like I am a fallen woman, all because I sought shelter from a storm." James's face went pale. "I am sorry." "I did not think about that. I should have." "Should have what?" Eleanor demanded. "Turn me away to freeze. That would have been worse." "I could have stayed outside," James said quietly. "Let you have the shack to yourself, and frozen to death yourself. That would not have helped anyone." James looked away, his jaw tight. "I am sorry for the trouble I have caused you." "It is not your fault," Eleanor said, some of her anger draining away. "It is the fault of small-minded gossips who have nothing better to do than make up stories about other people's lives. Still, I regret that you are suffering because of me." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. In the bright daylight, she could see him more clearly than she had in the dim shack. He was handsome in a rough, weathered way, but there was something more than that. There was sadness in his eyes, a bone-deep weariness that spoke of hard years and harder losses. "Tell me about yourself," Eleanor said impulsively. James looked startled. "What? Tell me about yourself." "If the whole town thinks we spent a scandalous night together, I might as well actually get to know you." "I do not think that is a good idea," James said carefully. "Why not?" Eleanor challenged. "Are you afraid of me?" "Yes," James said simply, and the honesty of it took Eleanor's breath away. "Why?" she whispered. James looked at her then, really looked at her, and Eleanor felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze. "Because you are Henry Morgan's daughter, because you are beautiful and educated and refined, and I am just a cowboy with nothing to my name but a horse and a saddle. Because being near you makes me want things I have no right to want." Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. What if I want those things too? You do not know what you are saying, James said, but his voice was rough with emotion. I know exactly what I am saying, Eleanor replied. She urged her horse closer until they were nearly touching. I have not been able to stop thinking about you since that night, about the way you held yourself so carefully away from me as if you did not trust yourself. About the way we woke up in each other's arms, about the look in your eyes when I left. Eleanor, James breathed, and hearing her first name on his lips sent a shiver down her spine. My father suggested I marry you, Eleanor said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. To repair my reputation. I told him I could not marry a stranger, but you do not feel like a stranger to me, James. You feel like something I have been waiting for without knowing it. James looked tortured. You do not understand, I cannot offer you anything. I work for wages, I live in a bunkhouse with a dozen other men, I have no land, no house, no future to speak of. You deserve so much more than that. What if I do not care about those things? Eleanor asked. What if all I care about is the way you make me feel? The way you look at me like I am something precious. The way you held me during the storm. I cannot, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. Eleanor reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his saddle horn. Yes, you can. We can figure out the rest together. James looked down at her hand on his and she saw the war playing out on his face. Want versus duty, desire versus honor, and slowly, so slowly, she saw want begin to win. I do not want to hurt you, he said softly. Then do not push me away, Eleanor replied. That is the only thing that will hurt me now. James turned his hand over so their palms were touching. His hand was calloused and rough, so much larger than hers, but his touch was gentle. I think I have been half in love with you since you stumbled through that door looking like a drowned kitten, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Joy burst through Eleanor's chest like sunrise. Then stop fighting it. Stop fighting me. James looked up at her, and the naked emotion in his eyes made Eleanor's breath catch. Your father will never approve. I am not good enough for you. Let me worry about my father, Eleanor said. James, I am 22 years old. I know my own mind. And I know that I want to get to know you better, that I want to see where this leads. Is that so terrible? No, James said. It is the best thing anyone has ever offered me, which is why I am terrified I will somehow ruin it. Eleanor smiled, feeling lighter than she had in days. You will not ruin anything. Now, are you going to court me properly, or do I have to do all the work? A slow smile spread across James's face, transforming it from handsome to breathtaking. I suppose if I am courting Henry Morgan's daughter, I had better do it right. Would you allow me to call on you tomorrow evening, Miss Morgan? I would be delighted, Mr. Hartley, Eleanor said formally, but she was grinning. They sat there for a moment longer, hands still touching, smiling at each other like fools. Then James reluctantly pulled his hand away. I should let you get back to your work, he said, and I have fences to mend. Until tomorrow, Eleanor said. Until tomorrow, James agreed. Eleanor rode home feeling like she was floating. The center of the town, her father's worry, all of it seemed distant and unimportant compared to the warmth blooming in her chest. James Hartley was going to court her. James Hartley, who made her feel safe and excited and alive all at once. Her father was less thrilled when she told him that evening. Eleanor, are you certain about this? Henry asked, his brow furrowed with concern. You barely know this man. I know enough, Eleanor said firmly. I know he is honorable and kind. I know he treats me with respect. I know he makes me happy. What else do I need to know? What about his prospects? Can he provide for you? What kind of life can he offer you? I do not know yet, Eleanor admitted, but I want to find out. Papa, please, give him a chance. Give us a chance. Henry looked at his daughter for a long moment, and Eleanor could see the struggle on his face. Finally, he sighed. Very well, he may call on you, but I will be watching him closely, Eleanor. If he does not treat you right, if he is not serious about his intentions, I will send him away. Thank you, Papa, Eleanor said, hugging him tightly. James arrived the next evening promptly at 7, riding a sturdy bay horse and wearing what were clearly his best clothes. They were still work-worn and simple, but they were clean and neatly pressed. He had shaved and combed his hair, and he looked nervous enough that Eleanor wanted to kiss him right there on the porch. But her father was watching from the parlor window, so she simply smiled and invited James inside. The evening was awkward at first. Henry interrogated James with the thoroughness of a court prosecutor, asking about his family, his background, his finances, his plans for the future. James answered every question honestly, and Eleanor could see her father's respect growing despite himself. James's story was a sad one. He had grown up in Texas, the youngest of 4 children. His parents and 2 of his siblings had died in a yellow fever epidemic when he was 16. His remaining brother had been killed in a bar fight 2 years later. James had drifted north, working on various ranches, saving what money he could but never quite able to get ahead. "I know I do not have much to offer," James said, looking Henry straight in the eye, "but I am a hard worker and I am honest. I would treat your daughter with the respect and care she deserves, and I would do everything in my power to build a good life for her." Henry was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What are your intentions toward my daughter, Mr. Hartley?" "To court her properly, sir," James said. "And if she will have me to marry her?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. They had not talked about marriage explicitly, though it had been implied. Hearing James say it out loud made it real. Henry nodded slowly. "Very well. You may court Eleanor with the understanding that I will be keeping a close eye on things, and if you hurt her, Mr. Hartley, you will answer to me." "I would expect nothing less, sir," James said. After that, the evening went more smoothly. Eleanor served coffee and cake, and they talked about less weighty topics: the weather, the ranching conditions, the upcoming harvest. James was not a naturally talkative man, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. Eleanor found herself drawn to his quiet strength, to the way he listened more than he spoke. When it was time for James to leave, Eleanor walked him to the door while her father discreetly remained in the parlor. "Thank you for tonight," Eleanor said softly. "I know my father can be intimidating." "He loves you," James said. "I would be the same way if I had a daughter. He is just trying to protect you." "And what about you?" Eleanor asked, looking up at him. "What are you trying to do?" "I am trying not to kiss you on your father's porch when he is probably watching through the window," James said with a rueful smile. Eleanor laughed. "That is probably wise. But soon," James promised, and the heat in his eyes made Eleanor's knees weak. Over the next few weeks, James called on Eleanor 3 times a week. They took long walks around the ranch, talking about everything and nothing. Eleanor learned about James's love of horses, his dream of someday having his own small spread. James learned about Eleanor's childhood, her love of reading, her frustration with the limitations placed on women. They also spent time working together. James helped Eleanor with the fence repairs, and Eleanor showed James her father's innovative irrigation system. They were both most comfortable working, and there was something intimate about laboring side by side in the Montana sunshine. The town gossip gradually died down, replaced by speculation about an impending engagement. Eleanor still faced some cold shoulders and disapproving looks, but with James by her side, she found she cared less and less what small-minded people thought. One evening, about a month after they had started courting, James took Eleanor to a hill overlooking both ranches. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, and the view was breathtaking. "I wanted to show you something," James said. He pointed to a small valley nestled between 2 rises. "See that land there? It is about 50 acres and it is for sale. The owner is moving back east and needs to sell quickly." Eleanor looked at the land. It was good grazing country with a creek running through it and stands of cottonwood trees for shade. "It is beautiful." "I have been saving my wages for years," James said quietly. "I have enough to make a down payment on that land. It would not be much at first, just a small cabin and a few head of cattle, but it would be ours. A start." Eleanor turned to look at him, her heart pounding. "Ours?" James took both her hands in his. "Eleanor Morgan, I know we have only been courting for a short time, but I have never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength and your kindness and your stubborn determination to see the best in people. I love the way you laugh and the way you are not afraid of hard work. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy if you will let me. Will you marry me? Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. James let out a breath that sounded like relief and joy combined. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. May I kiss you now, please? Eleanor breathed. James lowered his head slowly, giving her time to change her mind, but Eleanor did not want to change her mind. She wanted him, with an intensity that made her shake. When his lips finally touched hers, it was gentle at first, almost tentative. But when Eleanor pressed closer, winding her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened. James's arms came around her waist, pulling her tight against him, and Eleanor felt like she was burning from the inside out. All the carefully controlled distance James had maintained, all the polite restraint, melted away in the heat of that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. I have wanted to do that since the moment I saw you, he admitted. Why did you wait so long? Eleanor asked, only half joking. Because I was terrified, James said honestly. Terrified that you would realize you could do so much better than me. Terrified that I would somehow lose you before I ever really had you. You have me now, Eleanor said firmly, and you are not losing me, not ever. They stood there on the hill as the sun set, wrapped in each other's arms, making plans for their future. They would marry in the fall, after the harvest. James would buy the land with his savings, and Eleanor's father had already promised to gift them some cattle as a wedding present. It would not be an easy life, but it would be theirs. When James asked Henry for Eleanor's hand in marriage the next day, Henry gave his blessing. You are a good man, James Hartley, he said. Take care of my daughter. With my life, sir, James promised. The next 3 months passed in a blur of preparations. Eleanor and James worked together to build a small cabin on their new land. It was only 4 rooms, simple and rustic, but Eleanor loved it because it was theirs. James crafted the furniture himself, working late into the night to make sure everything was perfect. The women in town gradually thawed toward Eleanor as word of the engagement spread. It was hard to maintain disapproval in the face of such obvious happiness. Eleanor and James were clearly deeply in love, and even the hardest hearts softened watching them together. They were married on a crisp October day in 1884 in the small church in town. Eleanor wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. James wore a new suit that had taken a significant portion of his savings, but he wanted to look his best for his bride. As Eleanor walked down the aisle on her father's arm, she could see James waiting at the altar. He looked nervous and awestruck, and so handsome that Eleanor felt her breath catch. When she reached him and placed her hand in his, she felt complete in a way she never had before. They spoke their vows in clear, steady voices, promising to love and honor each other all the days of their lives. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed Eleanor with a tenderness that brought tears to many eyes in the congregation. The reception was held at the Morgan Ranch, with half the county in attendance. There was dancing and music and more food than anyone could eat. Eleanor danced with her father, with James, with old friends and new, but her favorite moment was late in the evening when James pulled her aside and whispered, "Can we leave yet? I want to take my wife home." Eleanor blushed but nodded eagerly. They said their goodbyes and rode to their new cabin under the stars. James carried Eleanor over the threshold, and she laughed with pure joy. Their wedding night was everything Eleanor had hoped for and nothing like she had imagined. James was gentle and patient, taking his time to show Eleanor all the ways he loved her. And afterward, lying in his arms in their own bed in their own home, Eleanor had never felt so complete. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," James murmured, pressing a kiss to her hair. "Thank you for moving close that night in the lined shack. Thank you for not letting me keep my distance." Eleanor smiled against his chest. "Thank you for taking me in during the storm, for being honorable even when it was hard." "For loving me, always," James promised, "for the rest of our lives." The first years of their marriage were not easy. Ranching was hard work and money was tight. They faced drought and disease, lost cattle to wolves, struggled through brutal winters. But they faced it all together, and that made all the difference. Eleanor proved to be a natural rancher with a sharp mind for business and a tireless work ethic. James was patient with the animals and had a gift for breeding strong, healthy stock. Together, they slowly built their ranch from a small homestead into a thriving operation. 3 years into their marriage, Eleanor gave birth to a son they named Henry after her father. He had James's dark hair and Eleanor's determined chin. 2 years later came a daughter, Sarah, with Eleanor's brown eyes and James's quiet disposition. And 3 years after that, another son, Thomas, who was loud and adventurous from the moment he was born. Eleanor's father remained active on his ranch, but spent more and more time at Eleanor and James's place, doting on his grandchildren. He and James had become close, bonding over their shared love of ranching and family. On their 10th anniversary, James took Eleanor back to the line shack where they had first met. It had been maintained over the years, still serving its purpose as emergency shelter for cowboys caught out in bad weather. "You remember?" James asked, holding Eleanor close as they stood in the small cabin. "Of course I remember," Eleanor said. "I remember being terrified and cold. I remember you being so determined to keep your distance. I remember waking up in your arms and realizing that you were what I had been searching for all my life. I was so afraid," James admitted, "afraid of wanting you, afraid that I could never be good enough for you, afraid that if I let myself love you, I would lose you. And now?" Eleanor asked, looking up at him. "Now I know that letting myself love you was the bravest and best thing I ever did," James said. He kissed her softly. "You saved me that night, Eleanor, not just from the storm, from a life of loneliness and emptiness. You saved me." "We saved each other," Eleanor corrected. "That storm brought us together. It was the best thing that ever happened to me." They stood there in the line shack, holding each other, remembering that fateful night 10 years earlier. So much had changed since then. They had built a life together, a family, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. As they rode home that evening, side by side across the Montana grassland, Eleanor thought about all the twists and turns that had brought them to this moment. If she had not ridden out that day. If the storm had not blown in so fast. If James had not been in that line shack. If he had not been the honorable, careful man he was. If she had not pushed past his defenses and insisted on getting close, so many chances for things to go differently. But they had not. The storm had trapped them together in that line shack. The cowboy had kept his distance, trying so hard to do the right thing. And Eleanor had moved close, refusing to let fear and propriety keep them apart, and from that one stormy night had come a lifetime of love. Years continued to pass in a rhythm of seasons and ranch work. Their children grew strong and capable. Young Henry showed a natural talent for training horses and announced at 16 that he wanted to expand that part of the ranch's operations. James supported him fully, helping him build corrals and work with local breeders. Sarah became fascinated with the business side of ranching, surprising everyone with her head for numbers. At 18, she started keeping the ranch's books and found ways to increase their profits that neither James nor Eleanor had considered. Thomas, the youngest, was the adventurer of the family. He talked constantly of seeing more of the world, of traveling east to the big cities. Eleanor and James encouraged all their children's dreams, knowing that the best legacy they could leave was raising children who were confident and capable. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the main house for a celebration. Henry Morgan, now in his 70s, sat in a place of honor, surrounded by his grandchildren. He had officially retired and signed the double M over to Eleanor and James 5 years earlier, though he still offered advice when asked. I remember when you first came to call on my daughter, Henry said to James during the celebration, his eyes twinkling. I thought you were a penniless cowboy with more nerve than sense. I was a penniless cowboy with more nerve than sense, James agreed with a laugh. But you proved me wrong, Henry continued. You have been a fine husband to Eleanor and a wonderful father to those children. You have built something real and lasting here. I could not have asked for a better son-in-law. James's eyes grew moist. Thank you, Henry. That means more to me than you know. Eleanor watched her husband and father embrace, her heart full to bursting. She had been so blessed in her life. Blessed with a loving father who had supported her even when society told him she was ruined. Blessed with a husband who loved her with his whole heart. Blessed with healthy children and a successful ranch, and it had all started with a storm and a line shack and a cowboy who had tried so hard to keep his distance. That night, after the party had ended and the children had gone to bed, Eleanor and James sat on their porch watching the stars. James had his arm around Eleanor and she leaned into him, comfortable and content. Do you ever regret it? Eleanor asked quietly. Marrying me, taking on a ready-made family with my father all the hard years when we were struggling. James looked at her in genuine surprise. Never, not for one single moment. Eleanor, you are the best thing that ever happened to me. This life we have built together, it is more than I ever dreamed possible. I feel the same way, Eleanor said. Sometimes I think about that girl I was, riding into that storm, how scared I was, how I had no idea that night would change my entire life. I think about the man I was, James said. So determined to keep everyone at a distance, so convinced I did not deserve anything good. If you had not pushed, if you had not insisted on getting close, I would have let you ride away and spent the rest of my life regretting it. I am glad I was pushy, Eleanor said with a smile. I am glad you were pushy too, James agreed. He tilted her face up to kiss her, and the kiss was sweet and familiar and full of 20 years of shared love. More years passed. Henry Morgan passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78, surrounded by his family. His death was hard on Eleanor, but she found comfort in knowing he had lived to see her happy and to know his grandchildren. The ranch continued to prosper. Young Henry married a girl from town and brought her home to live with them, building a house on the far corner of the property. Sarah, determined and independent, decided to go to college in Denver to study business, shocking everyone but making her parents proud. Thomas, true to his adventurous nature, left at 19 to see the world. He sent letters from Chicago, New York, and even from Europe. Eleanor worried about him but understood his need to explore. She and James had given their children roots. It was natural that they would want to test their wings. On their 30th anniversary, Eleanor and James took a trip to the line shack again. It had become a tradition for them, returning every few years to the place where their story began. The shack looked much the same as it had 3 decades earlier, though a bit more weathered. They brought blankets and food and planned to spend the night, just the two of them. As the sun set, they lay together on the narrow cot, just as they had that fateful night in 1884. But now they fit together perfectly, years of sleeping side by side having taught them exactly how to curl around each other. I am 52 years old, Eleanor said, and I still feel like that frightened girl sometimes. Amazed that I get to wake up next to you every morning, amazed at the life we have built. I am 56, James said, and I still cannot believe a woman like you chose a man like me. You could have had anyone, Eleanor. You could have married a rich rancher or a town businessman. Instead, you chose a cowboy with nothing but a dream. I chose the man I loved, Eleanor corrected. The man who made me feel safe and cherished and alive. The man who has been my partner in every way for 30 years. I would make the same choice again 1,000 times over. James held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, which was now streaked with gray just as his was. I love you, Eleanor Hartley. I have loved you since the moment you stumbled into this shack during a storm. I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Eleanor whispered. Forever. They made love that night in the line shack, tender and slow, a celebration of 3 decades of marriage and the lifetime of love still ahead of them. And afterward, they fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms just as they had that first night. The years continued to flow by like water. Thomas eventually returned home at 25, having satisfied his wanderlust. He brought with him a wife, a spirited young woman from Boston who took to ranch life with surprising enthusiasm. Young Henry and his wife gave Eleanor and James 4 more grandchildren. Sarah, still unmarried and running the business side of the ranch with brilliant efficiency, seemed perfectly content with her life. James and Eleanor grew older together gracefully. Their bodies showed the wear of years of hard work, but their love remained as strong as ever. They still worked the ranch, though they left more of the physical labor to their children and hired hands. They took long rides together in the evenings, walking their horses across land they had built together. On their 40th anniversary, the whole family gathered for a massive celebration. There were nearly 30 people now, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. The ranch had expanded to cover over 3,000 acres, a testament to years of hard work and careful management. During the party, young Henry stood up to make a toast. He was now 40 years old, a weathered rancher in his own right. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass. "Who taught us what real love looks like, who showed us that with hard work and determination you can build something lasting. Who never let hard times break them and never took good times for granted. Everything we have, everything we are is because of you, thank you." There were tears and laughter and many more toasts. Eleanor and James sat at the center of it all, holding hands, watching their family with pride and joy. Late that night, after everyone had gone home or to bed, Eleanor and James sat on their porch as they had done thousands of times over the years. "We did well," Eleanor said softly. "We did," James agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "Do you remember what you said to me that first night?" Eleanor asked. "When I asked you to share the blanket, I said I did not trust myself," James recalled. "I was terrified of being close to you, terrified of wanting something I could never have." "And I said I trusted you," Eleanor said. "And I did. From that very first moment I trusted you. I knew you were a good man." "You saw something in me I did not see in myself," James said. "You always have. You made me want to be the man you believed I was." "You already were that man," Eleanor said. "You just needed to believe it." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. The same stars that had shone down on them 40 years ago when Eleanor had ridden into a storm and found shelter in a lined shack. The same stars that had witnessed a cowboy keeping his careful distance and a woman moving close. The same stars that had seen the beginning of a love story that had lasted a lifetime. James and Eleanor lived to see their 50th anniversary. The celebration was smaller this time as they were both in their 70s and tired more easily. But their love had not diminished with age. If anything, it had grown deeper, richer, more precious for all the years they had shared. They still took rides together, though on gentler horses at a slower pace. They still returned to the line shack every few years, though now their children insisted on accompanying them partway to make sure they arrived safely. They still held hands on the porch in the evenings, still kissed good morning and good night, still looked at each other with the same wonder they had felt 40, 50 years before. James passed away peacefully in his sleep at 78, with Eleanor lying beside him as she had for over half a century. His heart simply stopped, worn out from years of hard work and a lifetime of love. Eleanor grieved deeply, but she did not regret a single moment of their time together. She had been blessed with 50 years of love with a man who had cherished her every single day. Not everyone could say that. She lived for 3 more years after James died, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She told them stories of the old days, of building the ranch from nothing, of the hard winters and the good harvests, of their triumphs and struggles. But her favorite story to tell was always about the storm that had trapped them in a lined shack together, about the cowboy who had kept his distance until she moved close, about the moment she had known with absolute certainty that she had found the man she would love forever. Eleanor passed away on a quiet spring morning, sitting in her rocking chair on the porch she had shared with James for so many years. The doctor said her heart had simply given out, but her children knew better. She had gone to be with James, to continue the love story that death could pause but never truly end. They buried Eleanor next to James on a hill overlooking the ranch they had built together, the land they had loved, the legacy they had created. And if on quiet evenings when the wind blows just right, some say you can see two figures riding across the grassland, side by side, hands clasped between their horses, still together after all these years. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, each one adding their own chapter to the story. But they all remembered the foundation on which it was built, a love story that began in a storm and lasted a lifetime. A story about a cowboy who tried to keep his distance and a woman brave enough to move close. A story about trust and honor and the courage to reach for happiness even when it seems impossible. And on stormy nights, when the rain beats against the windows and the wind howls outside, the family gathers in the main house and tells the story once more of Eleanor and James and the night that changed everything. They tell it so their children will know where they came from. They tell it to honor the love that built their family. They tell it because it is a story worth remembering, worth preserving, worth passing down through the ages. A story about love finding a way, even in the middle of a storm.